Tonight, we're boarding a flight into the golden age of air travel. A time when stepping onto a plane felt less like catching transportation and more like stepping into a dream. The airline was Pan American World Airways. That was its official name, grand and ambitious. But over the years, the words got shorter, the legend got bigger, and soon it was just Pan Am. Its blue globe logo became iconic, one of the most recognizable symbols in the world. It stood for adventure, for possibility, for an era when international flight was new enough to feel daring and glamorous enough to feel like you'd made it just by stepping on board. Pan Am wasn't just an airline, it was a cultural event. It introduced the world to the jet age, to exotic destinations, to a new idea of travel. At its peak, it felt untouchable. But like all great stories, Pan Am's arc had a rise and a fall. Tonight, we'll drift through that arc together, from its ambitious beginnings in the 1920s to its iconic jet age dominance, and finally to its quiet final landing in 1991. Along the way, we'll visit floating clipper ships, the iconic JFK Worldport terminal, first-class service that felt like a private club in the sky, and the moments that grounded the blue globe for good. Settle back. The seatbelt sign is on, but only because it's a long, smooth glide tonight. The engines are humming softly, the lights are dimming, and we have plenty of sky ahead. The year was 1927. Charles Lindbergh had just flown solo across the Atlantic. Aviation was still young, thrilling, and a little dangerous. The kind of thing people read about in newspapers, not something most expected to experience themselves. Pan American Airways began humbly. It wasn't founded as a glamorous international carrier. It started as a small operation with a practical mission: delivering mail. The very first route? From Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. Not exactly a globe-spanning empire, but it was a start. The aircraft was a single-engine Fokker trimotor, sturdy, dependable, and a little noisy. It could carry mail sacks and a handful of passengers, if they didn't mind a ride that was more adventure than luxury. The Fokker's engines had a distinctive sound, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that passengers could feel through the fabric seats. The cabin smelled of leather, engine oil, and the salt air that drifted in whenever the door opened at stops. It wasn't quiet like modern jets. You had to raise your voice to be heard over the propellers. But that sound became part of the romance, the mechanical heartbeat of early aviation. But the seeds of Pan Am's future were there from the very beginning. Founder Juan Trippe, not a bad last name for starting an airline, he had a vision, not just of flights to Havana, but of a true international airline. An airline that could connect continents, that could make the world feel smaller in the best possible way. In those early years, Pan Am focused on Latin America. New routes opened to Mexico, Central America, and down into South America. The company negotiated landing rights, built relationships, and just as importantly, built infrastructure. Because in the 1920s, flying wasn't like today. Airports themselves were quite rare. Weather forecasting was rudimentary. Many destinations didn't have proper runways at all. Pan Am had to figure out how to make aviation possible in the places it wanted to serve. The airline pioneered radio navigation systems for its routes. It established weather stations in remote locations. It trained local mechanics and ground crews. Pan Am wasn't just flying to those destinations, it was making them accessible for the very first time. The early passengers weren't tourists, they were adventurers, businessmen, diplomats, people who had practical reasons for getting somewhere fast, who were drawn to the novelty of flight itself. A typical flight from Miami to Havana in 1928 might carry 6 passengers: a sugar plantation owner returning from New York meetings, an American journalist covering Caribbean politics, a wealthy widow seeking winter warmth, and perhaps maybe a young couple on their honeymoon, splurging on what was still an exotic way to travel. They'd gather at the small terminal in the pre-dawn darkness, stamping their feet against the Florida chill, watching ground crews load mail bags into the Fokker's cargo hold by lamplight. It started to develop a certain personality: reliable, adventurous, a little daring, and just exotic enough to catch people's imagination. Passengers on those early flights weren't there for luxury. They were there for the novelty, for the sheer newness of being in the air. But Pan Am was already planting the idea that flying could be more than just travel, that it could be an experience worth seeking out. The 1920s were a modest takeoff, but the airline had altitude in its sights, and before long, it would start making headlines for something truly remarkable: planes that didn't just fly to airports, they landed on water. If Pan Am's beginnings in the late 1920s were a modest takeoff, the 1930s were a sweeping climb. This was the decade that took the airline from regional carrier to global legend, and the wings that carried it? Flying boats. They were called clippers, named after the swift sailing ships of the 19th century. And just like their nautical namesakes, they promised speed, distance, and adventure across the oceans. It's hard to overstate the romance of the flying boat in the 1930s. In an era when most runways couldn't handle large aircraft, Pan Am designed a way to make the world accessible without them. Use the oceans themselves as runways. Water landings meant a plane could reach almost any coastline, and suddenly routes to places like Manila, Hong Kong, and Auckland became possible. But these weren't just planes that happened to float. They were designed for spectacle. The Boeing 314 Clipper, Pan Am's crown jewel, looked like something out of a futuristic travel poster. Sleek silver fuselage, massive wings that spanned over 150 feet, and inside, a cabin designed to impress. Imagine yourself in 1939. You arrive at the Pan Am dock, not a terminal, but a seaplane base, often tucked along a harbor. There's no airport bustle, no crowded security line. Instead, there's the calm slap of waves against the pontoons. Dock workers move with practiced ease. The air carries the scent of salt water and aviation fuel, mixed with something distinctly luxurious: the polish used on the aircraft's gleaming metal skin. Seagulls call overhead, and you can hear the gentle creak of the mooring lines as the clipper rocks almost imperceptibly in the harbor swell. The clipper sits moored just off the pier, majestic and still, its reflection shimmering in the water. Passengers board by gangway, stepping directly from the dock onto the aircraft. Inside, the noise of the harbor fades. The air smells faintly of salt water and polished wood. This wasn't commercial flight as we know it now. The Boeing 314 had two decks, a rarity in aviation even today. On the main deck, wide, comfortable seating arranged like a luxury train car. A dining salon with linen tablecloths, fine china, meals prepared by actual chefs, multi-course dinners with wine. In the dining salon, tables were set with heavy silver cutlery and crystal glasses that somehow never seemed to slide despite the gentle motion of flight. Fresh flowers, orchids, or roses graced each table. The napkins were thick linen, pressed crisp. When the steward poured wine, he did so with the practiced grace of a maitre d' at the Ritz. Even the salt and pepper shakers were crafted from heavy silver, bearing the Pan Am logo in elegant script. Aft of the dining area, lounges where passengers could stretch out, play cards, or look out over the endless expanse of ocean. Below deck, sleeping berths, where long-haul passengers could change into pajamas provided by the airline and sleep horizontally, something many modern travelers would consider an unimaginable luxury. The berths on the Boeing 314 were something out of a luxury train. Each passenger had their own compartment with a proper bed, complete with Egyptian cotton sheets and down pillows, a small reading light, a fold-down writing desk, and even a tiny mirror for morning preparations. At night, the clipper would cruise serenely at 10,000 feet, its four engines humming their steady lullaby. Passengers would change into the airline-provided silk pajamas, slide between those crisp sheets, and fall asleep to the gentle rhythm of the aircraft moving through the calm air. Through the porthole windows, moonlight would glint off the ocean far below, or the aurora borealis might dance across Arctic skies if the route led toward the North Pacific. Stewards moved through the cabin like hotel staff, attentive but unobtrusive. This wasn't just travel, it was an event. The clippers didn't race across the oceans, mind you. A flight from San Francisco to Manila in the Philippines could take 6 days, stopping at island bases along the way for fuel, rest, and maintenance. But the journey was the point. As the engines roared to life, the sound was unlike anything passengers had ever heard before. 4 massive radial engines creating a symphony of power that you could feel in your chest. The plane lifted gracefully from the water, skimming the surface before rising into the open air. Spray from the pontoons catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. As the engines roared to life, the plane lifted gracefully from the water, skimming the surface before rising into the open air. Passengers could look down at islands sliding past below, or turquoise lagoons fringed with white sand. And the stops, they weren't just refueling breaks. They were destinations in themselves. Pan Am had built elegant facilities on remote Pacific islands like Wake, Midway, and Guam. Each stopover included comfortable hotels where passengers could stretch their legs, enjoy fresh meals, and sometimes even explore. At Wake Island, passengers might step off the Clipper onto a wooden pier extending into crystal clear water. The Pan Am Hotel was simple but elegant. Whitewashed buildings with red tile roofs, surrounded by palm trees and tropical gardens. Dinner would be served on the terrace, fresh fish caught that afternoon, with conversation drifting between tales of where passengers had already been and dreams of where they were going. Some guests would take evening walks along the beach, collecting shells or simply watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and pink. The pace was unhurried. The flights were smooth. Every landing was a return to the water, a soft splashdown, the spray rising alongside the windows before the plane settled into a gentle taxi toward the dock. By the late 1930s, Pan Am Clippers connected the United States to Latin America, Asia, and Europe. The airline had built bases on remote islands like Midway and Wake and Guam, places that became stepping stones across the Pacific. Each new route was celebrated like a triumph. The first commercial flight across the Pacific in 1935 ended up being front page news. The Clippers became symbols of American ingenuity, diplomacy, and style. For many, this was the first experience of the wider world. For others, it was proof that the globe itself was getting smaller, and Pan Am's blue logo was the thread stitching it together. The Clipper era wasn't just about luxury or speed, it was about possibility. In the 1930s, the idea of boarding a plane in San Francisco and somehow arriving days later in Hong Kong or Manila was astonishing. Pan Am didn't just sell tickets, it sold the promise that the world was accessible. The Clippers were also a statement. Pan Am wasn't a regional airline anymore. It was an international airline, and it was setting the standard for everyone else. The romance of the Clipper era, it wouldn't last forever. Technology was moving quickly, and the Second World War would change aviation in ways that no one could have predicted. But for a brief, shining moment, Pan Am's flying boats made the oceans feel smaller, the world feel closer, and the act of travel itself feel like an adventure worth savoring. As the 1930s drew to a close, Pan Am was already a legend in commercial aviation. But the world was changing. In 1939, war erupted in Europe. And while the United States didn't enter the conflict until 1941, the aviation landscape was already shifting. Pan Am, with its unmatched global routes, infrastructure, and their long-range aircraft, they were perfectly positioned to play a crucial role. When World War II began, commercial airlines around the world were pulled into service. Pan Am was no exception. Its Clippers, once luxury liners for wealthy travelers, became vital military transport aircraft. Their long range and ocean hopping ability made them invaluable for moving personnel, equipment, and critical supplies across vast distances. The same Wake Island, Midway, and Guam bases that had been glamorous stopovers for civilian passengers now became strategic military waypoints. Pan Am's contributions to the war effort weren't just about flying soldiers and supplies. The airline worked closely with the U.S. military, sometimes openly, sometimes more quietly, to build airfields in these remote locations. Before the war, Pan Am had already been building bases along its routes. Now those bases became military airstrips, and in many places, Pan Am crews were the ones doing the actual work, the surveying, engineering, and constructing. This gave Pan Am a unique advantage. When the war ended, those same bases were still there, still connected to Pan Am's network. The Clippers themselves were pressed into service for the U.S. military. These were no longer the luxurious linen tablecloth voyages of the earlier 1930s. The cabins were stripped down, sleeping berths were placed with cargo space. Yet, their long-haul capabilities remained unmatched. One famous example, the Pacific Clipper. In December 1941, the aircraft was on its way to New Zealand when news of the attack on Pearl Harbor broke. With the Pacific suddenly closed, the crew had to improvise. Instead of returning across the Pacific, the Clipper continued westward, around the globe. The flight took a month, covering more than 31,000 miles, stopping in unfamiliar cities, navigating uncharted routes. It was the first round-the-world flight by a commercial aircraft, and it wasn't even planned. Stories like that cemented Pan Am's reputation as not just a commercial airline, but an airline that could operate on a truly global scale, even in the most challenging circumstances. By 1945, the war was over. The world had changed dramatically, and so had aviation. During the war, aircraft technology had advanced at an astonishing pace. New engines, new navigation systems, stronger and faster planes, and Pan Am, with its global experience, was ready to take advantage of it. While other airlines had to rebuild, Pan Am already had a global network of bases and landing rights, experience operating in extreme conditions, and brand recognition as the airline that could get anywhere. In the immediate post-war years, Pan Am leaned into its global image. Its advertisements promised not just travel, but adventure. Passengers, they weren't just booking a ticket, they were booking a seat with the airline that had crossed the oceans during war and peace. The airline's blue globe logo became a subtle symbol of American reach and modernity. It was as much about prestige as it was about transportation. And as veterans returned home with stories of distant places they'd seen, well, Pan Am's promise of global access felt more tangible than ever. The world had grown smaller during the war, and Pan Am was ready to help people explore it in peacetime comfort. And as the 1940s turned into the 50s, a new technology was about to give Pan Am a whole new era of dominance, the jet age. By the mid-1950s, Pan Am was already the most recognized name in international aviation. But something was about to change, something that would transform air travel from the rhythmic elegance of the flying boats into the sleek, modern rush of the jet age. And as usual, Pan Am would be first. In 1958, Pan Am introduced the Boeing 707 to its fleet, the first American jet airliner to enter commercial service. This was no gradual evolution. It was a leap. The 707 flew higher, faster, and smoother than any propeller-driven aircraft. A transatlantic crossing that once took 12 hours could now be done in 8. The sound was completely different, too. Gone was that rhythmic thrum of propeller engines. Instead, passengers heard the high-pitched whine of jet turbines spooling up, then the smooth, powerful rush of takeoff that pressed you back into your seat. At cruising altitude, the cabin was quieter than anything that had come before. A steady whisper of air and the barely perceptible hum of engines far beneath the wings. And Pan Am didn't just fly the 707. It launched the jet age with a flourish, holding press events, publishing glamorous timetables, and promising that passengers would travel faster than sound, but in complete comfort. Flying in the jet age wasn't just about speed. It was about style. Pan Am understood this better than anyone. The airline's branding became a master class in aspirational marketing. Its posters showed sleek jets soaring over the Eiffel Tower, Big Ben, the pyramids. The famous blue globe logo became shorthand for global sophistication. And then there were the uniforms, designed by top fashion houses of the era. First Oleg Cassini, later Emilio Pucci. Pan Am stewardess uniforms were crisp, tailored, and instantly recognizable. The pillbox hats, the matching gloves, the neatly pressed blue suits, they became as iconic as the planes themselves. The morning ritual of a Pan Am stewardess, the proper name for the times, by the way, was precise choreography. Hair rolled and pinned into the perfect chignon, the pillbox hat positioned at exactly the right angle, white gloves stretched tight, not a wrinkle showing, the blue jacket buttoned just so, the gold wings pinned precisely above the left breast pocket. Even the lipstick had to match Pan Am's exact shade of red. Walking through an airport terminal, these women didn't just look professional. They looked like they belonged to something larger, something glamorous, something that had promised adventure just by association. These uniforms weren't just clothes. They were part of Pan Am's identity. The crew represented American professionalism and elegance around the world. And then there was Pan Am's signature terminal at JFK, the Worldport. Opened in 1960, the Worldport looked like something straight out of the future. A massive circular terminal with a dramatic overhanging roof that allowed jets to park directly under cover. The terminal was the brainchild of architect Tippett Abbott McCarthy Stratton, designed in the sleek modernist style that defined the early 1960s. The roof was a marvel of engineering, a thin concrete shell that curved gracefully overhead like a giant wing frozen in flight. The glass curtain walls stretched from floor to ceiling, creating the illusion that passengers were already airborne, even while still on the ground. Walking into the Worldport was like stepping into a cathedral of flight. The soaring concrete ceiling, it created a sense of space that made even the largest jets look graceful. The air carried the scent of jet fuel mixed with coffee and cigarettes from the departure lounges. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, you could watch ground crews in crisp uniforms moving with choreographed precision around gleaming aircraft. For a passenger in 1965, the experience began well before boarding. Stepping out of a taxi under that sweeping roof, you'd feel the hum of the terminal around you, a blend of languages, a shuffle of well-dressed travelers. Inside, the check-in counters stood like polished marble altars to international adventure. The departure board was a work of art in itself. Split flap displays that clicked and whirred as destinations changed. London, Paris, Rome, Tokyo. Each city name that appeared was a promise, an invitation to adventure. The sound of the flaps turning became part of the Worldport symphony, along with the gentle chime of boarding announcements and the distant whistle of jet engines warming up on the tarmac. Porters in crisp Pan Am caps would carefully tag suitcases bound for Paris, Rome, or Tokyo. From the mezzanine level, you could watch the bustling departure floor below, your own flight number glowing on a split flap display. Boarding wasn't a rush, it was a moment. Passengers gathered near the glass windows, pausing to look out at the gleaming jets parked just beyond arm's reach, knowing that soon they'd step through a jet bridge or down an outdoor stairway, into the waiting cabin, the world stretching out ahead. The passengers could look out from enormous glass windows, seeing their aircraft waiting just steps away. The building wasn't just a terminal, it was a stage. Arriving at the Worldport meant you had arrived in the jet age. And even the smallest details of the Worldport spoke to Pan Am's attention to style. The ashtrays were made of heavy glass with the Pan Am logo etched in gold. The carpeting was thick, muffling footsteps and creating an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. The lighting was warm and indirect, making everyone look a little more glamorous. The Clipper Club at Pan Am's first-class lounge occupied a prime position on the upper level. Members could retreat from the bustling main terminal into a world of leather armchairs, polished wood paneling, and, of course, complimentary cocktails. Large windows offered panoramic views of the tarmac, where Pan Am jets sat like blue and white sculptures against the New York sky. Stewardesses would occasionally pass through in their crisp uniforms, en route to their next flight, nodding politely to the passengers who would soon be in their care. Even today, decades after it was demolished, the Worldport lives on in memory as one of the great architectural icons of mid-century air travel. Now, inside the aircraft, the Pan Am experience reached its peak. In first class, passengers settled into wide seats, not rows squeezed together, but arrangements with space to walk and chat or simply look out the window at the curve of the horizon. A first-class cabin on a Pan Am 707 in 1962 felt more like a private club than an airplane. The seats were wide, upholstered in soft leather that had been hand-selected for both comfort and durability. Each seat had its own reading light, individual air vent, and fold-out writing table. The cabin walls were lined with polished wood veneer, and the overhead bins were crafted from the same warm-toned materials. Soft classical music played through hidden speakers, barely audible above the gentle whisper of jet engines. Service began before takeoff, of course. Stewardesses offered champagne or cocktails, served in heavy crystal glasses that never seemed to slip despite the movement of the aircraft. Hot towels appeared on silver trays. Fresh flowers, orchids, or roses graced each place setting. Stewardesses served multi-course meals on fine china, shrimp cocktails, Chateaubriand carved tableside, champagne poured into crystal flutes, and after dinner there might be a cheese course, coffee, or even a cigar service for those inclined. The meal service was theater. Stewardesses wheeled carts down the aisle like servers in a fine restaurant. The main course arrived under silver cloches, dramatically lifted to reveal perfectly presented dishes. Wine was poured with ceremony, the stewardess rotating the bottle with a practiced twist to prevent drips. Even the coffee service was elaborate, served from silver pots into delicate cups, with real cream in tiny pitchers and sugar in heavy glass bowls. In economy, service was still far above what we imagine today. Passengers had roomy seats, attentive service, and actual meals, all part of Pan Am's philosophy that flying should feel special, no matter where you sat. This was the era immortalized in books, magazines, and films, and later revisited in Catch Me If You Can, where Leonardo DiCaprio's Frank Abagnale Jr. effortlessly glides through airports, flanked by impeccably dressed Pan Am crew. Pan Am wasn't just an airline. It was the airline. It was the brand people imagined when they thought of international travel. And for travelers in the 1960s, flying Pan Am meant you had arrived in every sense of the word. By the mid-1960s, Pan Am's reach was unmatched. The airline served destinations on every continent except Antarctica. Its network stretched from New York to Tokyo, from Miami to Buenos Aires, from San Francisco to Sydney. Pan Am was the official American flag carrier abroad, even though it was technically a private airline. It represented the U.S. overseas as much as any embassy. The airline's crews were admired worldwide. Its planes were instantly recognizable. Its standards set the tone for the industry. But even as Pan Am reached its cruising altitude of success, the seeds of change were already planted. New technologies, shifting economics, and evolving passenger expectations would soon demand an even bigger leap forward. The jet age made Pan Am bigger, faster, and more glamorous than ever. But at the close of the 1960s, a new era was coming, one even larger, even more ambitious. The jumbo jet was on the horizon, and Pan Am would be first once again. In the late 1960s, the airline industry was about to take another giant step forward. Literally. The Boeing 707 had made jet travel fast and glamorous, but it was still a relatively intimate experience. Passenger numbers were limited. Tickets were expensive. Flying was still something only a fraction of the population could afford. But that was about to change. Boeing had been working on a larger aircraft, one that could carry twice as many passengers as the 707. It would be called the Boeing 747. And from the very start, Pan Am was there. Pan Am's visionary founder, Juan Trippe, believed that the 747 would transform air travel. He pushed Boeing to build it and then placed a massive order before the first plane had even flown. It was a gamble. The 747 was enormous, expensive, and untested. Airports would have to modify gates and runways just to handle it. But Tripp was convinced that this was the future and that Pan Am would lead the way. January 22nd, 1970, New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. The first Pan Am Boeing 747, christened Clipper Young America, sat gleaming on the tarmac. Its distinctive hump-backed fuselage towered above the crowd. The tail fin wore the proud blue globe. The aircraft looked impossibly large sitting on that tarmac. Ground crews, dwarfed by its massive bulk, moved around it like ants servicing a sleeping giant. The engines, 4 massive turbofans, hung beneath wings that seemed to stretch forever. Even seasoned aviation workers stopped to stare. This wasn't just a bigger airplane. It was a fundamentally different kind of machine. And inside, the cabin felt like something out of science fiction. A spiral staircase led to the upper deck, which housed an exclusive lounge. Wide-body cabins gave an unprecedented sense of space. The economy section had 2 aisles, making boarding and movement feel like stepping into a grand hallway rather than a cramped tube. This was no longer just an airplane. It was a flying building. When Clipper Young America took off for London, it wasn't just a flight. It was a declaration. The jumbo jet era had begun, and Pan Am, well, they were leading it. To understand the impact of the 747, you have to understand the scale. The Boeing 707 could carry about 140 passengers. The 747 could carry more than 350. It was as if Pan Am had suddenly invented a way to fit 2 airplanes worth of people into a single flight. The cargo hold alone was vast enough to swallow entire automobiles. The fuel tanks could hold more than 50,000 gallons, enough to fill a small swimming pool. The wingspan measured 195 feet, wider than the Wright brothers' first flight was long. Even the tires were massive, each one taller than a person and weighing more than 250 pounds. Imagine being Margaret Thompson, a secretary from Cleveland, boarding her first 747 in 1971 for a dream vacation to London. She'd saved for 2 years for this trip. As she stepped into the wide cabin, she couldn't help but gasp. The space, it just seemed impossible, like walking into a hotel lobby that happened to be 6 miles high. She found her window seat, accepted a complimentary champagne from a smiling stewardess, and realized that this moment, looking down at the clouds from her very own window, was worth every penny she'd saved. The 747 wasn't just about size, it was about accessibility. With more than double the capacity of previous jets, airlines could offer more seats at lower fares. International air travel, once the domain of the wealthy or the business elite, began to open up to middle-class travelers. Pan Am's 747 fleet, well, they made it possible for more people than ever to see the world. Trips that had once been dreams, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, started to become attainable. And yes, Pan Am kept its sense of style. The upper deck of the 747 became Pan Am's signature experience. Accessed by that elegant spiral staircase, it felt like a private club in the sky. The lounge was intimate, perhaps 20 seats arranged in comfortable groupings around cocktail tables. The windows were smaller than in the main cabin, but offered a unique perspective, higher above the wing. The lighting was soft and warm, casting everything in golden tones. Passengers sipped champagne or cocktails, chatted quietly, and occasionally wandered to the windows to look down on cloudscapes that stretched to the horizon. The sound up there was different too, quieter, more intimate. You could hear the gentle clink of ice in glasses, the rustle of newspaper pages, the soft murmur of conversation between passengers who had, for this moment, escaped the world below entirely. Flight attendants treated the upper deck like a private club, offering personal attention and exclusive amenities. It was first class within first class. On the main deck, first class was revolutionary in its own way. Each seat was essentially an individual pod, wide, comfortable, and surrounded by enough space to feel private even in a cabin full of people. The armrests were wide enough to hold a drink, reading material, and personal items. The tray tables were solid and stable, large enough to handle a full meal service without crowding. When reclined, the seats offered a genuinely restful experience with footrests and pillows that actually supported sleep. The sense of scale was breathtaking. The wide body design gave the cabin an airy openness no jetliner had offered before. Passengers could stand, stretch, and walk the aisles without that sense of bumping shoulders every few steps. Meals in first class still arrived on china, with wine pairings and silver cutlery. Flight attendants, impeccably dressed in the classic Pan Am blues, moved with practiced ease, balancing trays in the gentle sway of the sky. The dinner service took on almost theatrical proportions in the spacious 747 cabin. Carts rolled down the wide aisles with barely a whisper on the thick carpeting. Tables were set with heavy linen cloths that draped properly in the generous space between seats. The china, genuine Rosenthal, bore the Pan Am logo in elegant blue script. Wine glasses were crafted from lead crystal, heavy enough to feel substantial but perfectly balanced in the hand. The menu options rivaled fine restaurants. Passengers might choose between Chateaubriand with Béarnaise sauce, fresh lobster thermidor, or perhaps duck à l'orange. Each dish arrived under a silver cloche, lifted dramatically to reveal perfectly plated presentations. The wine list featured selections from the world's finest vineyards, with stewardesses trained to discuss vintage and provenance like professional sommeliers. Even economy class felt revolutionary. The extra width and dual aisles meant there was room to breathe. Meals were included. Drinks were poured generously. And there was still that feeling that you were traveling not just to another city, but into another world. Economy passengers on a Pan Am 747 experienced something almost unimaginable by today's standards: space. The seats were wider than modern first class seats on many airlines. The pitch, the distance between rows, allowed actual legroom. Flight attendants served real meals on proper trays: hot entrees with vegetables, bread rolls with butter, and dessert. Even the coffee was served in ceramic cups with saucers, not paper or plastic. The two-aisle configuration meant boarding and deplaning were smooth processes as well, not the cramped shuffles of smaller aircraft. Passengers, they could stretch their legs by walking to the rear of the cabin where Pan Am had installed lounge areas with couches and standing room. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Cloud9 Red-Eye, the only nightcap designed for the truly ambitious traveler. Whether you're in first class or wedged between two armrests in 37B, Cloud9 Red-Eye will still have you sleeping soundly before the seatbelt sign turns off. Infused with a secret blend of mid-century sedatives, the kind that aren't legal now, tropical fruit juice, and the faintest whisper of jet fuel, Cloud9 works at cruising altitude and somehow even faster at taxi speed. Cloud9 Red-Eye, guaranteed to make that layover in O'Hare feel like a pleasant dream. Side effects may include missing your connection, hugging the beverage cart, and speaking like an inebriated Dudley Moore and Arthur for the rest of the flight. Boeing had bet big on the 747, but it was Pan Am that made it a success. As the launch customer, Pan Am's massive initial order signaled confidence to the industry and to passengers. Other airlines soon followed, but Pan Am's blue globe remained the symbol most associated with the jumbo jet. Pan Am trained thousands of pilots and crew members to handle the new aircraft. It worked with airports to adapt gates and runways. It shaped the very infrastructure needed to make the 747 practical. Without Pan Am's leadership and commitment, the 747's rollout might have been much slower, more tentative. Instead, it became the aircraft of the decade, the queen of the skies. By 1973, Pan Am operated the world's largest fleet of 747s. The airline had configured them for different routes: high-density layouts for popular destinations, luxury configurations for premium routes. At any given moment, Pan Am's 747s were crisscrossing the globe like a fleet of flying cities. One might be approaching Tokyo's Haneda Airport at sunrise, its blue and white livery gleaming in the morning light. Another would be pushing back from London's Heathrow bound for New York with a full load of transatlantic passengers. A third might be taxiing at Sao Paulo's airport, while yet another sat parked overnight in Sydney, being serviced for the next day's flight back to Los Angeles. By the mid-1970s, Pan Am's 747s were just crisscrossing the globe everywhere, from the Worldport at JFK to London Heathrow, from Tokyo to Sydney. The sight of a Pan Am jumbo jet at the gate became an emblem of the era. The ground operations required to service a 747 were magnificent to watch. Catering trucks, tall as two-story buildings, pulled up to multiple doors simultaneously. Fuel trucks pumped thousands of gallons through multiple connection points. Baggage carts formed long trains loaded with hundreds of suitcases bound for distant cities. Ground power units supplied electricity while the aircraft's massive engines rested. The choreography was complex, precise, and somehow beautiful. A ballet of logistics that made intercontinental flight possible for hundreds of passengers at once. The airline was at its peak. Its network spanned the world. Its fleet was the envy of the industry, and its passengers were living out a new dream of air travel, one where the world felt just a little smaller. But even as the 747 symbolized success, the seeds of challenge were already being planted. The oil crisis of the 1970s, rising competition, and a changing industry would test Pan Am in ways it hadn't faced before. For now, though, the blue globe still shone brightest in the sky. Through the early and mid 1970s, Pan Am still ruled the skies. Its 747s crisscrossed the globe. The Worldport buzzed with activity, and the Blue Globe logo was as recognized as Coca-Cola's. But in aviation, as in life, even the smoothest flight can encounter sudden turbulence. The first tremor hit back in 1973. The OPEC oil embargo sent fuel prices skyrocketing almost overnight. For airlines, fuel was, and is, one of the biggest costs of operations. For an airline flying massive four-engine 747s on long-haul routes, the impact was enormous. Pan Am had built its model on luxury, long-range flights, and a global network. But when fuel costs spiked, those same strengths became vulnerabilities. A 747 flying from New York to London consumed roughly 18,000 gallons of fuel, enough to fill the gas tanks of 450 automobiles. When fuel prices doubled, then tripled, every single flight became exponentially more expensive to operate. Routes that had been profitable at $3 a barrel of oil became loss makers at $12 per barrel. And then, in 1979, it happened again. Another oil crisis, another sudden, crushing increase in fuel prices. The 747s, once Pan Am's greatest asset, became expensive to operate. The very size that made them revolutionary also made them costly when demand softened. At almost the same time, another seismic shift hit. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Before deregulation, routes and fares were tightly controlled by the U.S. government. Pan Am had been granted a special status, a de facto monopoly on most U.S. international routes. But Pan Am had no domestic network. For years, it had been the glamorous international airline, the chosen instrument of American diplomacy in the skies. Domestic flights? Those were for other carriers. After deregulation, though, the playing field opened. Other airlines could compete on international routes, and Pan Am could now enter the domestic market. But it had no infrastructure to compete effectively. And for Pan Am employees who had built their careers around international service, the prospect of domestic routes felt like a step backward. Flight attendants who had served champagne over the Atlantic were suddenly working shuttle flights between Boston and Washington. Pilots who had navigated to Hong Kong and Sydney found themselves flying routine hops to Detroit and Miami. The glamour that had defined Pan Am's identity seemed to be evaporating with each domestic route added to the schedule. In an attempt to solve the problem, Pan Am made one of its most famous and most costly moves: the acquisition of National Airlines in 1980. On paper, this gave Pan Am a domestic network almost overnight. In reality, it was a mismatched marriage. National Airlines' fleet was quite different. Its routes were different. Its culture was very different. So integrating the two was messy and very expensive. National Airlines had been a scrappy, no frills carrier focused on efficiency and basic service. Its employees were used to quick turnarounds and practical operations. Pan Am's employees, well, they were trained in the art of international hospitality and attention to detail. Merging these two cultures was like trying to blend champagne service with bus route efficiency. The result satisfied neither Pan Am standards nor National's practicality, and it came at the worst possible time. Fuel costs were soaring, competition was fierce, and the economic climate was uncertain. Through the 1980s, Pan Am faced stiff competition like it had never seen before. Airlines like TWA, Delta, American, and United were expanding their international presence. Discount carriers were emerging in the deregulated environment. Pan Am's once pristine reputation as the international airline was being chipped away, and the prestige of air travel itself was changing. Flying was becoming more common. More people could afford it, which was a victory for accessibility. But it also meant the exclusivity that Pan Am had built its brand on was harder to sustain. Even the magnificent Worldport began to show signs of strain. The terminal that had once felt spacious and futuristic now seemed a bit dated. Newer terminals at other airlines featured more modern amenities, better shopping, and just more efficient layouts. The Worldport's circular design, once revolutionary, created long walking distances that frustrated hurried passengers. The building that had symbolized Pan Am's dominance was becoming a reminder of an earlier era. Even as the challenges mounted, Pan Am remained a very powerful symbol. Its 747 still looked magnificent parked at gates around the world. The Worldport still pulsed with the energy of international travel. Crews still wore the famous uniforms, still offered world-class service. In the departure lounges, you could still hear that distinctive Pan Am boarding announcement echoing through terminals. Ladies and gentlemen, Pan American World Airways is pleased to announce the boarding of Flight 001 Clipper America with service to London Heathrow. The voice was crisp, professional, tinged with just enough formality to remind passengers they were about to embark on something special. Passengers, they still felt this thrill when boarding a Pan Am flight. But behind the scenes, the financial picture was growing much more turbulent. For the employees who had built their careers around Pan Am's golden age, the 1980s were heartbreaking. Flight attendants who had joined in the glamorous 60s found themselves serving passengers who saw flying as routine transportation rather than adventure. Pilots who had once been celebrities in uniform watched younger competitors fly newer, more efficient aircraft. Ground crews at the Worldport began to wonder quietly whether the Blue Globe would still be there in 5 years. In the executive offices above the Worldport, meetings grew more tense. Spreadsheets replaced optimism. Routes that had once been symbols of Pan Am's reach were analyzed coldly for profitability. The blue globe that had once seemed to promise infinite expansion now felt heavy, weighed down by debt and declining market share. By the late 1980s, Pan Am was no longer the unstoppable force it had been, and a tragedy in 1988 would further shake the airline's foundations. The 1980s began with Pan Am still a presence in every major airport, still the airline that had introduced the world to the jet age. But below the polished image, the numbers were no longer adding up. The oil crisis of the 1970s had left scars. The costly National Airlines acquisition had strained finances further. And deregulation meant Pan Am was no longer a monopoly on glamour. It was competing in a crowded, fiercely competitive market. Pan Am still had prestige, but prestige wasn't paying the bills. Then, in December 1988, tragedy struck. Pan Am Flight 103, en route from London to New York, exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 259 people on board and 11 on the ground. The bombing shocked the world. It was one of the deadliest terror attacks in aviation history, and it hit Pan Am at a moment when the airline could least withstand another blow. Public confidence was shaken. Lawsuits mounted. The financial toll was staggering. In the quiet tone of a sleep-through, we can say this. Lockerbie was more than a financial hit. It marked a shift in how people saw Pan Am. The airline that had once symbolized possibility was now sadly linked to tragedy. Unfairly, perhaps, but powerfully in the public's mind. In an effort to stay afloat, Pan Am began selling assets. The Pacific routes went to United Airlines in 1985. The European routes were sold to Delta in 1991. Even the Worldport terminal at JFK, the crown jewel, passed out of Pan Am's hands. The sale of the Pacific routes was particularly painful. These were the routes that had made Pan Am famous. The Trans-Pacific Clipper flights, the island-hopping adventures, the connections between America and Asia that had defined the airline's identity. Watching United's logo replace Pan Am's blue globe on flights to Tokyo and Sydney felt like watching the company's heritage being sold piece by piece. The blue globe logo was still on aircraft tails, but there were fewer of them. Each sale bought time, but not enough to turn things around. With each sale, a little more of Pan Am's soul seemed to disappear. The airline that had once spanned the globe was shrinking back toward its Caribbean roots. Employees watched destinations vanish from the route map like lights going out one by one. The grand vision of connecting the world was giving way to the stark mathematics of survival. And by 1991, Pan Am had been reduced to a handful of routes, mostly in the Caribbean and Latin America, not far from where it had started back in 1927. The 747s were mostly gone, sold or returned to lessors. The Grand International Network had been dismantled. The airline that had once connected continents was operating regional flights. On December 4th, 1991, Pan Am flew its final flight. Flight 436 from Bridgetown, Barbados to Miami. There was no grand farewell, no massive media spectacle, just a quiet landing in Miami, the engines winding down for the last time. For passengers and crew, it was bittersweet. Many of the flight attendants and pilots had been with Pan Am for decades. They'd seen the golden years, the 747 launches, the peak of the jet age, and now they were closing the logbook. Captain Ralph Pascoe, who had flown for Pan Am for 35 years, made the final announcement as Flight 436 taxied to the gate. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been our pleasure to serve you aboard this Pan American World Airways flight. Thank you for flying with us. His voice stayed steady, professional to the end. But the passengers who knew aviation history understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. The blue globe would no longer cross the skies. Pan Am disappeared as an airline, but its legacy remained enormous. The 707 and 747, the clipper ships, the Worldport, the uniforms, the destinations, all became part of aviation history. And more than that, Pan Am left behind a feeling, a memory of air travel as something special. A time when stepping onto a plane felt like stepping into the future. The blue globe still turns in documentaries, in movies, in the minds of those who remember that golden age of flight. Even after Pan Am's last flight in 1991, the blue globe never truly left the skies. The airline had vanished, but its image lingered, like the contrail of a jet at cruising altitude, fading slowly against the blue. Pan Am's identity was so strong that even decades later, it still shows up in films, books, and television. Catch Me If You Can captured the airline at its glamorous peak. Leonardo DiCaprio in a sharp suit, surrounded by uniformed Pan Am crew, walking through airports that seemed more like catwalks than terminals. TV shows like Pan Am, short-lived but stylish, recreated the look and feel of the jet age. All the pillbox hats, polished gloves, and elegant layovers in Paris and Hong Kong. The airline's name and imagery still show up in retro fashion, advertising, and travel nostalgia. For many, Pan Am remains shorthand for the idea of travel at its most sophisticated. The blue globe logo is still one of the most recognizable in aviation history. It appears on vintage luggage, collectible model planes, and old boarding passes traded among enthusiasts. Even people too young to have flown Pan Am often recognize the symbol instantly. In museums, Pan Am uniforms are displayed like couture fashion. Old menus from first-class service, champagne, filet mignon, delicate desserts are artifacts of a lost era. The Worldport terminal is gone now, demolished in 2013, but it lives on in photographs and in the memories of those who walked its glass concourses, looking out at rows of blue-tailed 747s. That promise still lives in the details collectors treasure. Vintage Pan Am bags, the blue speed bags carried by flight crews. They fetch hundreds of dollars at auctions. Menus from first-class flights, printed on thick stock with elegant typography, are framed like art. Even the Worldport's departure lounge ashtrays have become prized artifacts, tangible reminders of an age when every object bore the Pan Am globe. Aviation enthusiasts trade stories and photographs from the golden age. Former employees gather at reunions, sharing memories of routes they flew, destinations they served, passengers they met, pilots who once commanded 747s across the Pacific show yellowed logbooks filled with exotic airport codes. Flight attendants display their wings and badges with the pride of veterans showing service medals. The brand has been revived more than once, appearing in retro fashion lines, luxury travel goods, and even TV dramas. Today, you can still buy a Pan Am tote or see the globe logo on designer watches, a symbol that continues to whisper of a time when the sky really did feel like the limit. Why does Pan Am still hold such a place in our collective imagination? Partly because it represents a time when air travel felt special, when destinations seemed farther and reaching them felt like an event, and partly because Pan Am was a pioneer. The airline pushed technology forward, opened routes, built infrastructure. It helped shape the very idea of global air travel. And finally, because Pan Am's story is, at its heart, a classic tale. Ambition, success, glamour, and a bittersweet ending. But perhaps most importantly, Pan Am endures because it represents something we've lost in modern travel. Today, you might board a plane in Los Angeles and land in London without ever quite feeling that you've traveled. The airports look similar, the food tastes familiar, the experience is efficient but anonymous. Pan Am promised something different, that travel itself could transform you, that stepping aboard their aircraft meant entering a larger world. Modern travelers, cramped in narrow seats with bag fees and security delays, look back at Pan Am's era with something approaching nostalgia for an experience they never had. The idea of being served champagne in crystal glasses while cruising at 35,000 feet, it seems almost fantastical now. The notion that flight attendants were trained in the art of hospitality rather than just safety procedures feels like a story from another world. Pan Am's influence on aviation extends far beyond glamour and service, though. The airline's innovations in route planning, airport design, crew training, and passenger experience became industry standards. The Worldport circular design influenced terminal architecture worldwide. Pan Am's pilot training programs, they set safety standards that other airlines adopted. The airline's approach to international service, multilingual crews, local cuisine, cultural sensitivity, they became the template for all global carriers. Even the economics of the jumbo jet era trace back to Pan Am's bold gamble on that 747. Without Pan Am's massive initial order, Boeing might never have built the aircraft that transformed air travel from an elite activity to mass transportation. What we lost when Pan Am disappeared wasn't just an airline. It was an approach to travel that treated each flight as a small adventure, each passenger as a guest deserving of genuine hospitality. The efficiency gains of modern aviation have made flying accessible to millions more people, but something intangible was traded away in the process. The romance, the ceremony, the sense that crossing an ocean was still a remarkable thing deserving of special attention. And so we come in for our final descent. The engines hum softly as we pass through the last layers of cloud. The lights of the city begin to appear below, scattered like jewels. Outside the cabin windows, the sky is deepening from blue to indigo. Far below, the lights of highways trace patterns across the landscape like earthbound constellations. The cabin is quiet now, just the gentle whisper of air conditioning and the distant murmur of engines that have carried us safely through the night. Pan Am's story began in 1927 with a short flight to Havana. It climbed through the golden age of the Clippers, soared into the jet age, and reached its cruising altitude with the jumbo jet. It weathered storms, oil crisis, deregulation, tragedy, before making its final approach in 1991. But the blue globe still turns, in memory, in nostalgia, in the way we still look at a plane in the sky and feel that same spark of possibility. Tonight, maybe you'll dream of boarding a flight at the Worldport, of champagne in a crystal flute, of a stewardess in a pillbox hat offering a smile as you settle in to your wide seat. Maybe you'll dream of that spiral staircase leading to the upper deck lounge, where conversations were quiet and the view stretched to the horizon, of meals served on china that never rattled, of sleep that came easily to the rhythm of four engines carrying you across the dark Atlantic, of a time when the journey was as important as the destination, when the blue globe on the tail meant you were part of something larger than just getting from here to there. The seatbelt sign is off now. We've reached our destination. The cabin is settling in to its final quiet. Overhead compartments rest undisturbed. The gentle hum of systems powering down creates its own lullaby. Through the windows, the first stars are appearing in the deepening sky, each one a reminder that somewhere up there, the dream of flight continues. Good night, Pan Am.